enjoy. If you have your bulletin, you know we have a podcast. We're going to have weekly gatherings as well. Our pastor is going to be flying to Atlanta, and he's going to be studying, and he's going to be talking to people that sit with him in that plane for hours. So he's going to be sharing God's Word. But he will be back on Wednesday for our Wednesday prayer meetings. If you also notice, save the date on May 21st, we'll be putting together a parenting seminar with a number of other like-minded churches in Fresno. There's going to be more information to come. We also, on March 27th, will be having a kids ministry work lunch. And it'll be for all kids, the ministry work service, and there's some changes in the California law in regards to ministry workers that we have to go over, so please attend that. Also, council members, on Sunday, March 20th, we'll be having a council meeting right after the service, so save that date. And if you're a first-time guest, welcome to First Baptist Church of Oakhurst. Please fill out one of the information cards in the seat in front of you so that we can welcome you and send you a card. And then you can place the card. There's not going to be, the offering plate, but in the back on the outside there's an offering box. You can put the card in there. The reading this morning is going to be out of Psalm 2. Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers gather against the Lord and against the Anointed One. Let us break the chains, they say, and throw off all the fetters. For the one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. Then he rebukes them in his anger and terrifies them with wrath and sayings. I have installed my king in Zion, my holy hill. I will proclaim the decrees of the Lord. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have become your father. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possessions. You will rule over them with an iron scepter. You will dash them to pieces like pottery. Therefore, you kings, be wise. Be warned, you rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and you be destroyed in your way, for his wrath can flare up in a moment. Blessed are all who take refuge in him.
Amen. Well, good morning. Why don't y'all stand if you're able, and let's sing Your Grace Is Enough together.
Your
Christ alone, my hope is found. He is my light, my strength, my song, the cornerstone, the solid ground. Firm through the fiercest drought and storm. What heights of love, what depths of peace, with bitter still, when striving cease. My comforter, my all in all, here in the love of Christ I stand. In Christ alone, who took on flesh, fullness of God in helpless pain, this gift of love and righteousness, scorned by the ones He came to save. Still on that cross, as Jesus died, the wrath of God was satisfied. For every sin on Him was paid. Here in the death of Christ I live. Living around His body made, light of the world by darkness slain. Then bursting forth in glorious day, up from the grave He rose again. Yet as He stands in victory, since curse has lost its grip on me, for I am His and He is mine, bought with the precious blood of Christ. On Christ the solid rock I stand. All other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. On Christ the solid rock I stand. All other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. No guilt to life, no fear in death. This is the power of Christ in me. From life's first cry to final breath, Jesus commands my destiny. No power of hell, no scheme of man can ever pluck me from His hand. Till He returns or calls me home, here in the power of Christ I'll stand. Here in the power of Christ I'll stand. Here in the power of Christ I'll stand.
Be reading this morning out of Acts, the 16th chapter. As they traveled through the towns, they delivered the decisions reached by the apostles and elders at Jerusalem for them to observe. So the churches were strengthened in the faith and were increased in number daily. Missions, reaching people, growing churches. The apostles' ministry resulted in stronger churches with more members. Our prayers and offering focuses on continuing the work of the apostles. Our giving puts feet on our prayers.
love could remember the wrongs we have done. Omniscience, all-knowing, He counts not their sum. Thrown into the sea without bottom nor shore. Our sins, they are many, His mercy is more. Praise the Lord, His mercy is more. Stronger than darkness, new and born. Our sins, they are many, His mercy is more. Patience will wait as we constantly know. What Father so tender is calling us home. Here welcomes the peace, the vilest of poor. Our sins, they are many, His mercy is more. Praise the Lord, His mercy is more. Stronger than darkness, new and born. Our sins, they are many, His mercy is more. Riches of kindness He lavished on us. His blood was the payment, His life was the cost. We stood beneath the debt we could never afford. Our sins, they are many, His mercy is more. So praise the Lord, His mercy is more. Stronger than darkness, new and born. Our sins, they are many, His mercy is more. Praise the Lord, His mercy is more. Stronger than darkness, new and born. Our sins, they are many, His mercy is more. Our sins, they are many, His mercy is more. Our sins, they are many, His mercy is more. Amen.
Good morning. Good morning. I don't take it lightly, the opportunity to come up before you, and I appreciate it. I'm honored that the pastor's entrusted to allow me to do so more than once. I just want to say, on a side note, take time to thank the pastor for who he is. And the man of God that he is. I appreciate his commitment to the truth and dedication and commitment. And so I think I get emotional up here because I feel the sense of responsibility to do what's right as well and to share with you. I was sitting there thinking while I'm
starting up here, I always remember one preacher said, you know, it's funny the things that go through your mind just before you're supposed to get up and talk to people about, you know, God and His Word and stuff like that. And, you know, sometimes I have my own little, you know, get right with Jesus moment right there before everything happens. But one of the things that I thought about as we was talking about just here, and it goes along with what I'm talking about this morning, I remember Corrie ten Boom. You know what Corrie ten Boom is. Today I'm going to kind of talk to you about perspective and the way you look at life. And she said this one time. She says, if you look at the world, you will be distressed. If you look within, you'll be depressed. If you look at God, you'll be at rest. I like that. And that goes along with exactly what I'm going to talk about today, because we're looking at Ecclesiastes chapter 1. We're going to look at the first 11 verses, and I'm going to kind of set it up for you a little bit, and then we'll go through the verses, okay? Some time ago, a 2-year study was conducted by Johns Hopkins University, sponsored by the National Institute of Mental Health, which surveyed 7,948 students at 48 colleges. These students were asked what they considered very important to them now. 16% said making a lot of money. Okay. But surprisingly, 75% said finding meaning and purpose in their life was most important to them. In his book, Modern Man in Search of a Soul, secular psychologist Carl Jung wrote these penetrating words. He said, about 1/3 of my cases are suffering from no clinically definable neurosis, but from the senselessness and emptiness in their lives. This can be described as the general neurosis of our time. In his book, The Purpose-Driven Life, author Rick Warren talks about a survey done by Dr. Hugh Moorhead, where he wrote to 250 of the best-known philosophers, scientists, writers, and intellectuals in the world, and he asked them, what is the meaning of life? Some of them gave their best answer, their best guesses. Some admitted they just made up a purpose. And others were honest enough to say they didn't have a clue. In fact, a number of them wrote back and said, if you find out, would you please write back and tell us what it is? It is the absence of meaning and purpose in the lives of so many today, and especially in the lives of young people, that is causing so much substance abuse, promiscuity, and suicide. Suicide is the number 3 leading cause of death among people 15 to 24 years old. As I was preparing for this, I just happened to glance at an article on my phone. And it was of a girl named Katie Meyer, who was the Stanford goalkeeper. And on March 1st of this year, she committed suicide. She had led her school, Stanford University, to the 2019 national title and was found dead Tuesday in her campus dorm room on March 1st, March 1st. Katie was best known for stopping 2 penalty kicks in a dramatic shootout over the University of North Carolina in the 2019 final as Stanford hoisted the Women's Cup for the national championship. Her friends described her as a larger-than-life team player in all her pursuits. From choosing an academic discipline, she said, changed my perspective on the world and the very important challenges that we need to work together to overcome, to the passion she brought to the Cardinal women's soccer program. And there's other things that I could say, but when I saw that, I just had to stop and think about it for a second. How sad, you know? seems like if you look at this girl, beautiful young girl, seems to have everything together. You know, was on a national championship team at a prestigious university, but for whatever reason, she didn't find meaning and purpose and ended up taking her own life. I don't know. I don't use that to exploit that as an example, but it's sad. And I always had this fear. One of my fears in life is that, you know, you might be, might be in some kind of car accident and killed on the side of the road somewhere, and you're a 20-second comment from some news reporter on the news saying so-and-so, an accident happened on so-and-so, and you know, a man, 51-year-old man was killed, blah, 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 and stuff. And then, well, it's going to be great weather this next weekend, and whatever his favorite sports team is going to be playing, and that's it, and it's done. And if you look at how Solomon's going to look at life here in just a little bit as I present it, there's going to be a sense of futility and a sense of hopelessness and a sense of despair that I think all of us can relate to in some respect. There was a note written by a young college student, written before they took their own life, and it read this way: "To anyone in the world who cares, who am I? Why am I living? Life has become stupid and purposeless. Nothing makes sense to me anymore. The question I had when I came to college are still unanswered, and now I'm convinced there aren't any answers. There can be only pain and guilt and despair here in this world. My fear of death and the unknown is far less terrifying to me than the prospect of unbearable frustration, futility, and hopelessness of continued existence." It's a sad, sad statement. I'm sorry to depress everybody here, but, this is what, when we look at the book of Ecclesiastes, we find one man's search for true meaning and purpose in life. Now, Solomon was a uniquely qualified individual to do so, right? And one of the things we know about Solomon is that he wrote 3 books that we have inspired scripture, right? In the early years of his life, he wrote the book of romance, right? The Song of Solomon. And that's one of those that when you have young kids, you want to, be careful about how you go through it if you do, because, you have to do a lot of explanation. Then in the mid-new time of his life, you might say he wrote the book of rules. We know as the book of Proverbs. But in the latter years of his life, as he looks back over his life and what has truly given him meaning and purpose in life, he writes the book of Ecclesiastes. Some people call it the book of regrets. So Solomon, in writing Ecclesiastes, is looking back over his life and making some observations. During Solomon's reign, he was a 40-year period of no war, right? So he was able to devote more time to investigating the meaning of life. Furthermore, he was the wealthiest man around, right? There was nothing that he couldn't get if he wanted, right? In Ecclesiastes 1:16, it says, "I commune with my own heart, saying, Lo, I am come to great estate, and have gotten more wisdom than all they that have been before me in Jerusalem. Yea, my heart had great experience of wisdom and knowledge." Not only was he the wisest, or the wealthiest, but he was the wisest, right? And maybe the smartest. His IQ must have been pretty high. And so he sets himself to pursue what the meaning of life was. But interestingly, if you look in verse 2 of chapter 1 of Ecclesiastes, Solomon begins his book with his conclusion. You ever done that? You open a book and you just go to the last chapter and see how it all ends, right? Just to know, and then you kind of piece it together as you go, right? Some people can't do that, it just ruins it for you. But here we see in Ecclesiastes 1 verse 2, Solomon says this, he says, "Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity." Pretty depressing thought. Now this word vanity is used 38 times in this book, and it doesn't here mean to be vain. As someone once joked, says a woman came to a pastor one time and she says, "Pastor, I have to admit, I suffer from the sin of vanity." You know, she says, "Every morning when I get up, I admire myself for 30 minutes in the mirror." And the preacher replies, says, "My dear lady," says, "it's not the sin of vanity you suffer from, it's the sin of imagination." You'd like to be that quick sometimes, you know. But vanity here means emptiness, futility, without meaning. Read it that way. Emptiness of emptiness, right? It's futile, without meaning, like a vapor. What Solomon is saying here, beginning with his conclusion, is that life under the sun does not work. Vanity of vanities. He repeats it for emphasis' sake. In verse 3, he says this, in Ecclesiastes 1, he says, What profit hath a man of all his labor which he taketh under the sun? The Message reads, what is there left over to show for a lifetime of working your fingers to a bone? That's the way the Message reads. But I want you to notice something here. Look in Ecclesiastes chapter 6. Ecclesiastes chapter 6. Okay? And as I read this chapter for you, I want you to pay attention. Don't just let it go by, but listen. And listen to the sense of futility and frustration and hopelessness that Solomon is expressing. And there's a phrase in there you'll see that comes up in what he's trying to help you understand. This is Ecclesiastes chapter 6, verse 1. He says, I have seen another evil under the sun. And I'm using the New International Version here, and purposely so, because the New International Version is a thought-for-thought translation. So I want you to try to capture the thought of what Solomon was saying in our language today. I have seen another evil under the sun, and it weighs heavily on mankind. God gives some people wealth, possessions, and honor, so that they lack nothing their hearts desire. But God does not grant them the ability to enjoy them, and strangers to enjoy them instead. This is meaningless, a grievous evil. A man may have 100 children and live many years, yet no matter how long he lives, if he cannot enjoy his prosperity and does not receive proper burial, I say that a stillborn child is better off than he. Depressing thought. I didn't mean to depress everybody today, but it comes without meaning. It departs in darkness, and in darkness its name is shrouded. Though it never saw the sun or knew anything, it has more rest than does that man. Even if he lives 1,000 years twice over, but fails to enjoy his prosperity, do not all go to the same place? Everyone's toil is for their mouth, yet their appetite is never satisfied. What advantage has the wise over the fools? What do the poor gain by knowing how to conduct themselves before others? Better what the eye sees than the roving of the appetite. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Verse 10. Whatever exists has already been named, and what humanity is has been known. No one can contend with someone who is stronger. The more words, the less meaning. And how does it profit anyone? Verse 12. For who knows what is good for a person in life during the few and meaningless days they pass through like a shadow? Who can tell them what will happen under the sun after they're gone? Don't miss this point. This book is one man's search for meaning, as if there was no God in the picture. Okay? And he conveys this by a little phrase he's used 29 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. Under the sun. S-U-N. Okay? Solomon is going to look back over his life and tell us what life is like under the sun. And may I add, this is where Most of us are, many times, trying to figure out what life is all about and where is meaning and purpose. And we're looking at it under the sun. Without the sun, S-O-N. We're looking at life under the sun, S-U-N. Solomon's going to teach us 4 things here in regards to this futility that he sees. In verse 4 of chapter 1, it says, "One generation passeth away, and another generation cometh, but the earth abides forever." It's almost as if he's taking the newspaper in one hand and opening the obituaries and the births and just looking at it and seeing the comings and goings. I mean, I don't know if nowadays you don't have many newspapers. You have to look for finding a physical newspaper. But, I remember, my dad doing that and stuff, looking through the newspaper and reading the obituaries. And sometimes the older you get, the more you look for anybody you know. And I looked at, nowadays we have everything's online. I was looking at the Worldometer this week, and it has everything listed there that you can think of, and maybe some things you wish you didn't think of. But one of the things it lists is death by suicide. And it says, this was as of March 9th of this week, it's estimated that 198,333 people had committed suicide this year. This year. I assume that was in this worldwide. And I looked the next day at the same stat, and it had went up to 201,312. And I just did the math, subtracted the difference, and divided that by, 24 down to the second, and it's an average of 2 people every second. So you think of the time that we have taken in this service over a 60-minute period maybe, and the average number of people that have committed suicide in that time frame, that have entered into eternity without God, who have been looking at their life and perspective under the sun and seeing no meaning, no sense, no purpose. An average of 2 people per second. And he's saying, life seems just to be the same. One generation comes, another goes. One man is born, another dies. Life goes from the beginning to the end, and it just keeps repeating itself. There may be a sense of permanency to nature, but life is transient. As we said before, it's like a vapor. He touches on the nature of death, a subject that many never want to talk about. But Solomon, you have to understand, is near the end of his life, and so he's looking through this, looking back on his life, and it pervades his mind, and he reasons about the course of life and sees the futility in it. I always remember one of my favorite apologists was Walter Martin, and he always used to say, the death rate is always 1 per person. Right? Death comes to us all. There's a story that Rabbi Kushner, famous Jewish writer, if you know, in one of his books tells the story of a man who came to him for counseling. And this man said to him, "Rabbi, 2 weeks ago I went to the funeral of a co-worker of mine who was basically the same age as me." He went on to say, "I didn't know him well, but we talked and worked together, and we had kids about the same age." He says, "Rabbi, my friend suddenly died over the weekend, and a bunch of us who worked with him decided to go to his funeral. And we couldn't help but as we're at the funeral, each one of us were thinking the same thing. It's just as easily been me." He says, "That was 2 weeks ago. They've already replaced him at the office. His wife's talking about moving out of state to be back with her family. 2 weeks ago, he was working 50 feet away from me, and now it's as if he never existed." He said, "It's like a rock falling in the water, And then the water goes back to the same, but there's no rock anymore. Rabbi, he says, I've hardly slept at all since this happened. I can't stop thinking that it could have happened to me. And a few days later, I would be forgotten, as if I never existed at all. Shouldn't a man's life be more than that? I think that's the question, right? We all come to that. Isn't there more than just getting up, going to work, doing the same thing, going home, doing a few things, going to bed, getting up, doing it all over again? Solomon is saying, if you look at life without God, it just seems so futile. The course of life turning over and over, but there's no meaning in it. Look at verse 5, chapter 1. He says, the sun arises and the sun goes down, and hasteth to the place where he arose. Solomon uses the idea that the sun pants. It's like this can just keeps going, and it just keeps going from east to west, only to do what? Do the same thing, rise again and go pant to the west, all over again. He says it's endless. It repeats itself again and again and again and again. Solomon is basically saying that since the creation of the world, the sun has done the same thing day after day after day. Then look at verse 6. The wind goeth toward the south, and turneth about to the north. It whirleth about continually, and the wind returneth again to his circuits. Now this is kind of a remarkable statement, is it not, if you look at it carefully, because what is Solomon describing here? He's describing the world's great wind circuits and the global circulation of the atmosphere, long before it was ever really officially known, right? And if you look at a map nowadays, and I remember seeing to have one of my atlases, and it shows the wind bands across the latitudes across the globe, you know, and how they go back and forth, just as Solomon's describing here, right? But he's saying this, he says there's such a mechanical nature to it going on, and man is just caught up in the monotony of it all. You have the sun and the wind, and then in verse 7 he looks at the water. He says, all the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. And the place from whence the rivers come, thither they go return again. What's Solomon describing? The hydrologic cycle, right? I looked at Wikipedia's description of the hydrological cycle this week, and it says it's described as the continuous movement of water on, above, and below the surface of the earth. Solomon is saying the water is just like the wind and the sun, and just like the generations of life that come and go. He's saying that things just continue to be the same, that there's this mechanical, monotonous nature to life and the way the world functions, and things just keep repeating themselves over and over. There is a futility to life if you observe it without God in the picture. And even Christians get caught up in this sometimes, in this way of thinking. Until you do what? Until you remember God. Solomon then remembers the futility of life moves from the futility of life to the frustration of sin. Look in verse 8 of chapter 1. He says, all things are full of labor. A man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied without seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. He's saying that life without God ultimately is empty. This is exemplified in the world of entertainment. Now, I'm not going to tell you that this is something you should always do, but this is your homework. Go home this week and watch E.T., a little episode, Entertainment Tonight. And ask yourself, when you're watching that, what does it really matter? What difference does it really make in the grand scheme of things? You know, I know, especially for young people, that get caught up in, musicians or entertainers and various things, and they can describe for you all sorts of things about these people in the world of entertainment that really make no difference in their grand scheme of things at all, but they know them very well. And what that is a sign of is looking at life under the sun. Looking at life, trying to find satisfaction and fulfillment here and now, and maybe even meaning and purpose, but ultimately it's left empty and void. None of it satisfies. A person without God in their life just goes from one thing to the next, futilely trying to fill the void in their life. If you look at Acts chapter 17, verse 21, it says this: "For all the Athenians and strangers which were there spent their time in nothing else, but either to tell or to hear," what? "Some new thing." Right? Remember Paul's encounter with them? J. Vernon McGee used to say this, he said, "If it's new, it's not true. And if it's true, it's not new." Solomon is saying something similar. He says there's no real lasting satisfaction in this world under the sun. There's nothing truly new. Oh, we call our things. You might get a new phone, a new computer, a new TV, a new house, a new car. But what? 2 days later, 2 weeks later, 2 months, 2 years, they're obsolete. They're out of date. There's something else that's come out that's better. Right? It has a sense of futility. And we, even as Christians, can get caught up in this trap, trying to satisfy ourselves in this life under the sun. As nothing is fulfilling, nothing is fresh. Look in verses 9 through 11, which says this: "The thing that hath been, it is that which shall be, and that which is done is that which shall be done. And there is no new thing under the sun. Is there any thing whereof it may be said, See, this is new? It hath already been of old time, which was before us. There is no remembrance of former things, neither shall there be any remembrance of things that are to come with those that shall come after." There is nothing new under the sun. And why I say that, and what Solomon is saying, is there's nothing new being created. There are some things we call new and stuff in this world, but ultimately it is simply the rearrangement of what God had already created. We just put it together. Thomas Edison used to say his inventions were only bringing out the secrets of nature for the happiness of mankind. He didn't say, "I'm inventing something new that God never thought of." He's saying, "I'm simply putting together what already was there." You know? We don't create anything, only God creates. There's a poem by Rudyard Kipling which captures what Solomon is trying to say here when he says, "The craft that we call modern and the crimes that we call new, John Bunyan had them typed and filed in 1682. And that's just to say that while we may call it new and think of it new, ultimately it's not. It's not something new in the sense of being created new. And Solomon is also saying if you look at life without God, you see that ultimately everything in this life under the sun does not satisfy. It's not fulfilling and it's not new. There's a sense of futility in the world. You know, Solomon himself at one time walked with God, but what happened? As he got older, he married foreign wives who drew his heart away from God, right? He contaminated his life with visions of the world, and he ended up a frustrated, disillusioned, discouraged old man. And he ends up writing this book and talking about that futility. As he comes to terms in his own life, he realizes that without God, life does not have any meaning. He summarizes the central question of meaning in Ecclesiastes 6:12, which you've already read, but I'll say it again. He says, "For who knows what is good for a man in life, all the days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow? Who can tell a man what will happen after him under the sun?" Right? You know, I don't know, for me, this is just a side note, but sometimes when I go to, maybe it's morbid, but when I go to cemeteries, like I visit my mother's grave, and it's taken me 10 years to say the word grave about her, but when I go to cemeteries sometimes, and I'll look at other graves sites, and just look at the names and the year, the date of birth, the date of death, and stuff like that. And I just think about, what was that? Who was that person? What were they like? You know, and what kind of life did they have? You know, was there something like this in their life, a sense of futility, or did they know the Lord? You know, and of course, then I have to go around and clean everything up because that's what my mother would be telling me. I hear her words saying, straighten these up because you don't want to leave these looking bad. You know, so I find myself cleaning up all around hers and everybody else's around there. Well, that's just because I hear my mother talking. But there is only one who can help you find meaning and purpose in your life. Before we close, let's look at the key to the meaning and purpose in your life. Ecclesiastes 3:11. Turn your Bibles to chapter 3, verse 11. I want you to listen to this. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity in their hearts, except that no one can find out the work that God does from the beginning to the end. Now, before I talk about that first part, that last part, no one can find out the work that God does from the beginning to the end. There's some things in this life, and even in your own life, that we're just not meant, God didn't mean to explain to us. You know, simply trust and follow Him. Be obedient to Him. Okay? There are some things that are not going to be explained to you in this lifetime. Okay? And if you try to go through your life trying to figure it all out and answer all the world's problems, including your own, you're just going to end up in more sense of futility and frustration. But no matter who we are, this first part of this verse says that He has made everything beautiful in His time, and also He has what? Put eternity in our hearts. God has made us all the same in this respect. We are built with a place in our heart for God. He's created a sense of eternity in our hearts, and this place can only be filled with God. Nothing else will do. If we try to put anything else in its place, what happens? We quickly become frustrated, disillusioned, and discouraged, like Solomon. Okay? We will sense the futility of life without God. There cannot be meaning and purpose in our life without eternity in our hearts. God has not made us for this world. He's made us for the next. And He has put eternity in our hearts and wants to fill that with Himself, if we will allow Him to. But when we refuse to put God first in our lives, and we try to stuff our life with everything else in the place of our heart that is reserved for Him, we end up sensing the futility of life. Maybe to the point of some of those that I cited earlier that have taken their own life and seeing death and early death as more tolerable and desirable than what this world has to offer. Remember the average 2%. If you want to know meaning in your life, you have to cooperate with the one who made you and put God first at the center of your heart. It all begins with inviting Him to live within. You know, I keep going back to that statement about, George Barna's the study of, only 6% of Christians today have a truly biblical worldview. And I think of that, and I think, there's scriptures that talk about, deceiving ourselves. And I think even as the pastor mentioned earlier in Sunday school this morning, we need to search our own hearts and minds and make sure that we're not deceiving ourselves. And one of the things I think the telltale signs is if you live with a sense of futility and hopeless or despair in this life, it may be an indication that your perspective is not quite what it should be, and that you're living life under the sun. so much with the son, S-O-N. In John 14:6, Jesus says this. He says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He did not say a way, or one of many, or a truth, or just your personal truth. No, he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So if you want to find meaning and purpose, who should you look to? Jesus says it himself, right? Right there. Paul said it in one of my favorite verses is 2 Corinthians 4:6. And if you don't have this verse marked, you ought to highlight it. Get out your pen, get out your highlighter, and mark this verse down. 2 Corinthians 4:6. Okay? And always remember 2, 4, 6. Okay? 2, 4, 6. Okay? That's the way you can remember it. Just so you got to remember the book. But Paul here is speaking to 3 different cultures: Roman culture, Greek culture, and a Jewish culture, right? And who more uniquely qualified to do this than Paul himself, who was a Jew by birth, a Roman citizen, lived in a Greek city, right? And he understands who he's speaking to because of the way he describes it. Okay? I'm going to read to you this one time and then I'll repeat it after I explain a little bit more. It says, For God, who commanded the light to shine out of the darkness, has shown in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. Now you see the word light? Now without going into too much explanation, to the Jewish mind, light was representative of ultimate meaning and purpose in life. It's the pursuit of what life was. Okay? Knowledge was that to the Greek. Okay? We get so many philosophers and a lot of philosophy from, Greek philosophers. And then you have glory. What was it to the Romans? But that was the aim and purpose of life was to achieve glory in this life. Right? Now look back at this verse and look at it again. He says, For it is God who commanded the light to shine out of the darkness to what? To give us the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. Do you see what he's saying? He's saying to these 3 cultures and using what they use as the epitome of purpose and meaning in their life and saying if you want to find it, regardless of whether you're coming from this background, that background, or another one, Roman, Jewish, or Greek, or whatever it may be, it's found in the person of Jesus Christ. Like that. It's shown in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. The last half of John 10:10 says this. He says, I have come that they may have life and that they may have it what? More abundantly. Right? If you are living your life with this sense of despair and futility and you look at life as kind of senseless and empty, you're looking at it from the wrong perspective. And you're looking at it without Christ or God in the picture. Okay? Listen to what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 to 30. He says, Come to me, all ye who labor and are heavy laden. That's Ecclesiastes 1, right there. And I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For what? My yoke is easy, and my burden is light. Right? He's the one who can make the difference in your life. There's a story by a Russian novelist, Alexander Pitov, who talks about his own life, who grew up in, communist Russia. But he says one day that God got his attention. He was on the metro, he says, in the 27th year, while riding the metro on one day in Leningrad, he says, I was overcome with despair so great that life seemed to stop all at once. He says, suddenly, all by itself, a phrase appeared to me. Without God, life makes no sense. It just hit him like a brick. Without God, life makes no sense. He says, I kept repeating that phrase over and over to myself. And he says, when I got out of the metro and I walked into the light of God. If you try to make life work under the sun, S-U-N, you will fail. You will fail. It's not if or what, it's only a matter of when. Life does not work the way God intends it to work unless He's in the picture. The world is a closed system, so meaning has to come from outside this world, and the one who came into this world was Jesus Christ. One reason Christmas is my favorite holiday, because what is it? God coming into this world, right? There's hope. There's meaning, there's purpose. There is no meaning in life under the sun, S-U-N. But meaning is found in the Son, S-O-N. One last verse I want to say to you is 1 John 5:12. In the beginning of that verse says, He that hath the Son hath life. If you want to rise above the despair, futility, and frustration of what Solomon is talking about in Ecclesiastes, acknowledge that the eternity that God has put in your heart and embrace the eternal one. If you're already a Christian, embrace the Son, S-O-N. Stop living life under the sun, S-U-N. Okay? All right, let's stand, please. I should have had Martin coming up here, but that's okay. Hard as wood. Sorry about that. Didn't really coordinate this. You bow your head, close your eyes. I want to give you a chance to respond, if you will. This is just my personal thing. I don't know where you are in your life. I assume that most if not all of you here are Christians. And I think, though, that you might be able to relate. And but I want you to just think about what Solomon was talking about here, and how you're living your life. Do you have that sense of hopelessness, or do you have a sense of hope? God filled your heart with joy, or is it filled with despair? If there's anything you need to come for, whether it's getting to know Him, come. If there's something else, you can come to that as well. Let's give you a minute and just ask you to respond.
Deep
Thank you for coming today, and let's close with prayer. Father, I thank you for the time that we have. I thank you for these people here. I just ask that you would help us, whatever, regardless of who's saying it doesn't matter that I'm the one. I'm just the one that you wanted to use today. The Lord, is with your word that's being expressed to us. Lord, just ask that what you have to say to us burns within our hearts and minds. And as we go from here, Lord, that we find true joy and meaning and purpose in our lives, and we're able to share that with those around us when you put us in contact with us. Lord, I thank you for each one here. Be with the pastor and give him safe passage to where he's going and back. And we thank you for him. And just thank you for all the things you continue to do in Christ's name. Amen.